Hello and welcome to the 8th episode of A Woman Robbed, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is, where we talk about actresses who may have come close to earning Oscar nominations but were ultimately overlooked or omitted, or for one reason or another just didn't have the votes to make it into the final lineup, and discussing why they may have deserved to get in and why they ultimately didn't. And each episode has its own theme, presented as a double feature, and this week, in honor of Halloween, we'll be talking about two performances from horror or horror-adjacent films that were overlooked by the Academy in the Best Actress category, something that has happened for decades and decades to this day. And joining me today to help me break down two great examples of this is a real favorite of this show. You last heard her on the main show talking about the Best Actress lineup of 1974, which was such a great time, especially getting to discuss people like Jenna Rollins and Ellen Burstyn, Faye Dunaway, of course. She is the co-host of the Oscar Wild podcast and critic and podcaster for Awards Watch. Welcome back, Sophia Ciminello.
Hi, Kevin. Thank you so much for having me back. You know, A Woman Under the Influence is a horror movie in its own right, I would say.
That's true.
I think I'm so excited to talk about these incredible ladies today. And I don't get to talk about horror too often, talking mostly about Oscar nominated and winning films. So I can't wait because I love horror movies, and I specifically love actress-centered horror movies because we get to look at these intense social and political anxieties in really adventurous, complicated ways, and always through great performances. So thank you for having me. I'm always happy to be on and very excited to be back.
Yes. Well, I've already gotten multiple people in my DMs saying that we want Sophia back, so I'm just like, she was just on, but here you are.
That's so sweet, though.
Anyway, let's get into it. So I presented to my patrons here at And the Runner-Up Is a list of 15 actresses to vote on from horror or horror-adjacent movies who were on the radar for Oscar nominations but were ultimately snubbed. And just to recap the choices, we had Toni Collette in Hereditary, Joan Crawford in Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, Catherine Deneuve in Repulsion, Laura Dern in Inland Empire, Shelley Duvall in The Shining, Mia Goth in Pearl, Julie Harris in The Haunting, Deborah Carr in The Innocents, Jennifer Lawrence in Mother, Lupita Nyong'o in Us, Florence Pugh in Midsommar, Octavia Spencer in Ma, Naomi Watts in Mulholland Drive, and Sigourney Weaver in Alien, and Jo Beth Williams in Poltergeist. And the top vote getters here were Toni Collette in Hereditary and Naomi Watts in Mulholland Drive. So that's who we will be talking about today. As far as people who came close to being chosen here, both Shelley Duvall and Deborah Carr were very, very, very close. Hopefully I'll get to talk about those at some point, maybe next October. But anyway, here we are to talk about Mulholland Drive at Hereditary. Sophia, what are your overall thoughts on just these actresses, Toni, Naomi, and also this ongoing problem that the Academy has with horror performances and just very rarely getting that kind of recognition they deserve?
Yeah, so I think just starting with the list that you read off, as you were going through those names and seeing that poll on your Patreon page, I just thought, I love all of these performances. It was almost impossible to vote because I think what's cool about it is you can look at Toni Collette's career and you can look at Naomi Watts' career and you can make a really strong case that Mulholland Drive and Hereditary are their strongest films and strongest performances. And that's because these directors, David Lynch and Ari Aster, who I think wants to be David Lynch just a little bit maybe, they really let them fly in these incredibly complex, gnarly roles. And thinking about horror bias with the Academy just does not like complicated, unlikable women. We see that time and time again in those anonymous ballots, and it's infuriating. And horror movies let women be grimy and bloody, and it's really rare that you find like a demure, fully likable, whatever that means, woman in a horror movie. And I think that's one of the things that I love about the genre, and specifically with Naomi Watts' performance, you kind of see her play with the image of being this like picture perfect, optimistic woman, and then that completely flips, which I think is the brilliance of the movie and in her star turn there. But yeah, so many of my horror adjacent or horror performances that I love are just also really misunderstood in their time, which I think is an interesting thing with the Oscars. A lot of the horror performances end up being really criticized in their time. Not the ones we'll talk about today so much, but some like Faye Dunaway and Mommy Dearest, Shelley Duvall in The Shining, certainly. I love Megan Fox and Jennifer's Body, and they have to be reevaluated, I think, years later. And I think it's a good way to look at film history, too, is to just think about these actresses and what they're capable of doing when they don't have the constraints of, a standard drama or even a romantic comedy. They can really, really fly and be unafraid.
Yeah. And you can certainly see that very much so in both of these performances.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I also think this is yet another brilliantly chosen double feature by the patrons, I must say.
Yeah.
2 Australian queens here.
Mm-hmm. Our
both,
Aussie ladies.
Both. Yeah. And I think both are kind of underappreciated at times compared to maybe some of their peers who are more A-listers, namely Nicole Kidman, Cate Blanchett.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of like the one-to-one I do with like the 4 of them is like Naomi Watts is to Nicole Kidman as Toni Collette is to Cate Blanchett.
I like that.
Just saying.
Yeah.
Yeah. But both of them are fantastic and fully committed to their crafts. And these 2 performances are just like the prime examples for both of them, probably, like you said, of that commitment. It's not surprising to me that Oscar voters still struggle to take horror performances seriously, but it is disappointing. I'm not shocked. I'm disappointed that we are still at this point of just not recognizing this genre for just like the value that it provides, the level of emotional investment that the audience has with horror, and the way it can also comment on those real life issues, but in a different way. And it's like, if voters want to say they don't value horror as like best of the year material, fine, you don't have to nominate it for Best Picture. But like, we see all kinds of crappy movies get acting nominations
all the time.
Right? So I just struggle to see why we can't extend that to horror too. And also something like, in the case of Toni Collette, especially in Hereditary, yes, the supernatural element just completely takes over by the end. But for a large portion of the movie, she's giving just like a tour de force dramatic performance in a family drama, essentially. But it just happens to not be in this sort of skin of something that the Academy values. And it just seems like we only recognize horror at the Oscars when it's like 5 out of 5 masterpiece, like Get Out, sort of like game changer, or even things like Carrie or Misery that have like a literary component sort of that don't go too far into the deep end, I guess.
Yeah.
So anyway, it's frustrating to see that continued lack of respect when like literally like the history of film dating back to even before the Oscars has so many fantastic horror performances that were just overlooked in favor of these other performances that barely even make an impact past the year that they are released.
Yeah. Thinking about some of the acting categories that we get every year, I mean, the nominees that they choose from non-horror movies, that's scarier than some of our scariest horror films that we have. So they need to just embrace it and look at horror movies outside of makeup and hairstyling. I feel like they're fine with it there. They can do it. And like the Omen won score, which was a crazy one-off. But yeah, the acting branch, they need to get it together. I say this every year, whether it's about horror or not, but especially when it comes to horror movies.
Yes, absolutely. So very excited to talk about these 2 with you. Both of them, as we've been talking about already, have so much that we can discuss outside of even these performances. So yeah, interesting to see where we end up here. So shall we jump right in?
Let's do it. There's a lot to get into.
Well, we're going, as we always do, in chronological order. So we're going to start with Naomi Watts in Mulholland Drive. What a great easing our way into the pool here.
Truly.
You're playing a dangerous game here. If you're trying to blackmail me, it's not gonna work.
You know what I want. It's not that difficult.
Get out. Get out before I call my dad. He trusts you. You're his best friend. This will be the end of everything.
Okay, so we haven't been introduced to Naomi yet on the Best Actress series. She is coming. We'll eventually talk about her at least twice. There's still time for her to get more, but she's only been recognized twice. But Naomi Watts, she was born in England. Eventually, she moved with her family to Australia, where she developed her skills as an actress. She also became friends with Nicole Kidman during that time, and she really struggled to really break into the industry in a sort of major way, at least, doing a lot of smaller supporting roles in the 90s, although she was also the lead of Children of the Corn 4, so let's just acknowledge that.
Our screen queen.
Yeah, right? She was always there. Yeah, but she really didn't have a super mainstream recognition up to that point until David Lynch saw her headshot when he was casting Mulholland Drive and met with her and decided to cast her without having even seen anything she had done previously. So like literally it's kind of like what happened in the movie where he was like, this is the girl. But he obviously had a lot of faith in her. He actually has a quote where he said, I saw someone that I felt had a tremendous talent, and I saw someone who had a beautiful soul and intelligence, possibilities for a lot of different roles. So it was a beautiful full package. So there you go. But to get into somewhat of a description, it tells the story of a bright, aspiring actress named Betty, played by Naomi, who hopes to make her dreams come true in Hollywood. She moves into her aunt's apartment in Los Angeles, where she meets this sort of confused young woman who has amnesia after surviving a car crash, and this woman doesn't even remember her name, so she calls herself Rita after seeing a poster of Rita Hayworth. And while Betty is trying to break into the industry, she's also trying to find answers for Rita about her identity and what happened to her. Meanwhile, there's also another storyline involving a director who's being pressured to hire a certain actress for the lead of his new film. We also meet this guy who's having reoccurring nightmares. We have a hitman who's stumbling his way through a hit. And eventually we come to this point where the entire perspective of the film changes as we come to understand the truth of what we've been watching up to that point. So let's just get right into it here. I know we both love this movie. Tell me your experience with maybe even seeing this movie for the first time, what kind of effect it had on you and how you feel now, maybe if your feelings have changed, and just your overall thoughts on Naomi here.
Yeah, so Mulholland Drive is one of my favorite movies. I think it's a true masterpiece. It's also my favorite of David Lynch's films, and the first time that I saw this, I was very lucky because I got to see it in theaters for the first time. So it was a fully like uninterrupted viewing on the big screen. And it was when I was in college and I was like starting to really, I think, feel out my taste in film, find directors that I really liked. And this just knocked me out completely. And it's only gotten better on rewatch. So whenever this is playing in New York, like at a rep theater, anything like that, I try to go because I really do feel like it's one of those just true great film going experiences where you have to really get swept up in the details. And I love movies that are really ambiguous and don't have a lot of answers. And I love that David Lynch is also really committed to not answering those questions, but not in a way that is annoying. I think there are some films that are really concerned with riddles or these sorts of puzzle box constructions. And I admittedly have trouble with those because it feels like that's the point. And for this movie, that's not the point really at all. It's not knowing those answers. And for me, I also love films about Hollywood and I love films about actresses and identity, and I feel like this is the perfect nightmarish Hollywood film. It's a perfect double bill with another one of my favorite films, Sunset Boulevard, and I like how it dives into death and decay in Hollywood and into myth making, but also this sort of starry-eyed experience that you can have when you get to a place like LA, like Hollywood, that doesn't really exist anywhere else in the same way. And I feel like David Lynch has such a good understanding of what Hollywood is like and what LA is as a place. And the reason that this film is successful for me is because of Naomi Watts' performance. I feel like this character, like the degree of difficulty, I can't even think about it, how crazy it is that she's able to pull this off, because what she does here, like Betty Elms first, perfect name for this character, and
Yeah.
just how she arrives, it can almost feel like uncanny at first, I think, about her performance. It's so exaggerated and over the top, but what she said about this that I think is so smart is that when she's talking about David Lynch in this film, she said, he won't let you go further than the truth. So even when she felt like she was exaggerating and needed to go further, or she thought she was maybe going too far, she said that he always found a way to make sure she went right up to the line for the character. And I think it really turned out perfectly. So I think this is one of the great actress performances in history. And I'm biased because I love Mulholland Drive so much, but thinking about, you know, heartbreaking snubs or like people who didn't get in but should have, this is such an egregious, clear example of that for me.
100%. I absolutely love this movie for as unsettling and creepy and confounding as it can be.
Mm-hmm.
I just find the imagery on top of all the themes you just talked about so haunting and so effective, and really just it implants itself in my brain, you know, and like tapping into those subconscious fears, and the dream logic is so fascinating, especially on a rewatch once you know where it's all going.
Yeah.
And it's just to see Lynch really sort of laying out all these different pieces, you know, for 2 hours, and then just shaking up the board completely, you know.
Yeah.
But like somehow all of those pieces kind of like are landing in a different place, and it sort of creates like this nightmarish sort of pattern that takes on this deeper meaning the more you look at it. I just love that. Angelo Badalamenti's score, I just wanted to mention too. I think that is on a whole other level for him. Just the overall sound work is so guttural and like primal feeling, the darkness of it and the dread. And it really immerses you in the story, even if you have no idea what's going on a first watch. But then that emotional core of the whole film is Naomi Watts. And she just, like you were saying, has such a difficult task for so much of the film of just kind of representing an archetype more than an actual person, you know? And that's obviously not like a writing criticism, because it's very intentional what's happening here. But it's like after this, in the beginning, all these different vignettes that are so dark and disorienting, we're introduced to her, and she's just like this ball of sunshine. Literally, like the lighting is so, everything's so suddenly brightened. And I actually also forgot that the first line in the film from her is, "Oh, I can't believe it."
It's so
which, I mean,
good
it's like...
too. Oh, the delivery is incredible.
Yeah, but I think what makes her performance as Betty work as well as it does is that she kind of threads the needle between being aggressively cheery and optimistic, like Pollyanna almost, but also feeling sincere enough at the same time, especially when it comes to her and Rita, that you find yourself really sympathizing with her. Like you can believe that someone could be this optimistic if they've never been to Hollywood before and they've just moved from Canada, from their hometown or something, and she's just had these big dreams for so long, and that she hasn't been hardened by just the reality of how that dream can turn into a nightmare, basically, for so many people in Hollywood.
And Naomi had talked about auditioning for 10 years and then finally getting the call. And when she talks about her audition for the film, she said specifically that she didn't know who they wanted her to be. And I think that theme comes up through the film, and it makes it almost this meta commentary about actresses and about Naomi Watts, and kind of like you were saying at the beginning, how David Lynch cast her from a headshot. But I feel like when you think about the amnesia plot line in the film and not knowing who you are, not knowing what happened to you, not knowing where you came from, that's so LA. Like that act of forgetting is what happens, I think, to a lot of people who either find success and become famous, whether it's, getting a new name or just completely changing your way of life, or if you've been working for a long time and you've become really disillusioned with everything, you might forget who you were when you arrived too at the same time. And I think that what Naomi Watts does at the beginning, she taps into that specific type of optimism that she probably felt when she arrived like years before. And I think that's probably really hard to do if you are someone who's a bit further into your search for work. But I love the way that also she's just so starry-eyed and animated, and it connects so well with the styling of the character too, like her haircuts and the costumes that she's wearing, those like sweaters that are a bit sparkly, the cardigans, how she always has like a barrette in her hair. That just works so well for the design of this character and just being, like you said, a little Pollyanna, but also feeling like a real person. And I mentioned this to you before we started recording, but the movie that I'm so excited for you to see this year is May December, because there's a thing that Natalie Portman does in her performance that reminds me a little bit of what Naomi Watts is doing here, just with the specific, the way that her voice sounds and how she chooses to enunciate specific words and the level of seriousness you always have to kind of doubt a little bit, even though you know that the character is taking everything completely seriously around them. And yeah, so I'm very excited for you to see that. Little mini tangent, but
I was already excited for that movie. Like, that was my number one most anticipated. Now it's just like through the roof.
It's my number one of the year so far, so great. But I think too, she also gets into this version, almost like a modern day Betty Draper kind of way that she's moving through the world. Like, she almost feels like she's from another time altogether, which I really like. And I think that's all necessary in this setup of believing that this character, I don't know, I think it plays with your expectations about who this woman is and what she's capable of. And that's absolutely necessary for the rest of the film.
Yeah, great comparison there. She's also entirely trusting and helpful to Rita, and just really expressing this genuine kindness and patience in helping this woman she just met.
Yeah.
And it seems like there's no ulterior motives or very much hidden meaning behind Betty, other than just that kind of on the surface goodness and just wanting to be a good person. And I just feel like it's so difficult to play that. She actually had a quote after the fact about playing specifically the Betty character, where she said, "The hardest part for me playing Betty was I needed to make her human somehow. When I see her now, I go, oh my God, you're a psycho." But there were places where I tried to show that she had deeper dimensions. And I think she really does that. Less so in the Hollywood dreamy-eyed stuff, but specifically in the relationship with Rita, where you see just the pure kind of love.
Yeah, she's believable. She is believably someone who comes into a city that is also dark and dangerous. Like, yes, it's this like beautiful place where dreams can come true, but that kind of seedy underbelly to the city, she's just completely unaware of, it seems. So it makes sense that she would just, walk into this place where her aunt is letting her stay, and there's this woman there, and she's just like barely even fazed by it, right? She just takes her kind of in under her wing and wants to help her. And yeah, I think it is funny because now when you watch it, you're like, why are you doing this? Like, why are you letting this woman stay here? It doesn't make any sense, but it does for this character, I think, and for the dreamlike quality of the movie. And I love the scene too when they're, not to jump around, but when they're preparing for the audition. Yeah. It's just, it's so good how she just is going through those lines like in a rather generic way. And it's, I think, our first instance of this character not deceiving us necessarily, but how we can see that there's much more underneath later on when we actually see her auditioning when it counts.
Thank you for listening to this preview of A Woman Robbed, a bonus series from And the Runner-Up Is. If you liked what you heard and want to hear more, please go to patreon.com/andtherunnerupis and become a patron. Only $3 a month will get you access to bonus episodes and early access to regular episodes. Thank you so much for your consideration.